Hello, everyone, and thank you for joining us for this third and final workshop in partnership with World Space Week in support of this year's theme of entrepreneurship. My name is Kelly Kiedis Ogborn, and it's an honor to be with you to guide you through what is our concluding information to make you all space entrepreneurs and space champions. In our first workshop, we really delved into the entrepreneurial opportunities in the new space ecosystem and how you can take advantage of them. In the second one, we went a bit more in depth about winning strategies, how to create them, what needs to be part of them, and then really looked at the different types of funding sources that your business can go after and the pros and cons of each. And for this final workshop, what we are really going to talk about are tactics that you can use to position your product or service to best create champions for your work and gain customers. And we are going to approach this from a slightly different angle than some of you might be used to. The goal of this presentation is really to help you examine some of the basic tenets of human behavior that drive decision-making and drive the ability to absorb narrative, and outline some of the best practices that you can do to adopt and present the best value of your technology or business to each audience that you encounter. What it really comes down to as a starting principle is that beyond your product working, it comes down to the human side of business. It is critical to know who your audience is and how to communicate the impact of your work in a way that will resonate with them the most. And that comes down to understanding human behavior and motivational drivers. So let's get into the content. This workshop is broken down into 4 parts. We are going to spend some time talking about human and brain evolution over time. We're then going to go into adjusting your message, knowing the difference between audiences and how to appeal to them. And then lastly, the difference between being pesky and being persistent. The goal is for you to walk away with practical and applicable knowledge about human interactions, and we will supply you with tools and exercises that can aid you in your engagements. A primary focus of consideration for those that are trying to scale an idea or a technology within space is understanding how to bridge the gap between innovation ecosystems and the business world, and really making them both interact and engage harmoniously and effectively. For those in the research and development community, it is really important to start thinking about your work in a broader context, especially when you are trying to sell your idea or build out a business. And the way that I really like to illustrate this concept is through the juxtaposition of both of these gentlemen that you see on the screen. So on the left side of the screen is my science-minded example, who is Richard Feynman. And he was a popular American theoretical physicist in the 1950s and the 1960s. He really gained a lot of notoriety for his scientific ability, but he also was a really skilled communicator. So it made him really popular because sometimes those do not go hand in hand. And he is really credited with pioneering the field of quantum computing and introducing the concept of nanotechnology. So definitely has made his mark across the scientific and technical community. He also worked on the Manhattan Project during World War II. And in one of his more famous quotes, he said that for a successful technology, reality must take precedent over public relations because nature cannot be fooled. And what this really means is that even with the greatest of storytelling, when dealing with a tangible physical product, it either is or it isn't. So it either works or it doesn't. And a great recent example of this is the company Theranos and its founder, Elizabeth Holmes. So Theranos, for those of you who may not be familiar, was being praised and was really set to fundamentally change the landscape of blood tests. And while the company was on its rise, she was also being hailed as the next Steve Jobs. However, privately, their technology was an absolute disaster. It didn't work They were lying to investors, they were lying to potential customer sets. And it eventually caught up with them because they were not actually able to deliver on what they promised. So they were an example of the story being really good, but the technology and the business and the product not being able to back up the hype and the narrative. And now let's compare this to my business example of Dale Carnegie. So Mr. Carnegie was an American writer and lecturer, and some of his famous books include How to Win Friends and Influence People and The Art of Public Speaking. He also created numerous teaching courses in self-improvement, interpersonal skills, salesmanship, corporate trainings. He is really credited for the rise of the modern day salesman, and a lot of the personality traits associated with it are traced back to his teachings and his writings. And in one of his more famous quotes, he says, "When dealing with people, remember that you are not dealing with creatures of logic, but creatures of emotion." And I want us all to think about this for a second and how different each is, but also how they are both correct. So for Feynman and those purely in the technical world, reality needs to take precedent over public relations or over selling, because at the end of the day, your technology actually has to work. But for Carnegie, and for those in the non-technical business world, reality or a working technology doesn't necessarily convince people to buy. Emotion does. And so what we are going to talk about is how do you actually combine the two? And one thing to realize is that there is a far more powerful tool than emotion, and it's called motive. There is a reason behind everything and every action. And when you understand that concept and begin to understand people, selling to them becomes a lot easier. And in my opinion, there is really not enough stock placed in the gray area of intangible relationships. And that is really what we aim to move the needle toward today. Because for a successful strategy, there really needs to be a middle ground between the technical world and technology and business working, and then how you actually sell it. And one person who is really, really good at this and walks both of these worlds is Neil deGrasse Tyson. He demonstrates an ownership of knowledge, not just an awareness of facts. You can tell that when he speaks, he actually intimately knows what he is talking about. He intimately knows the technology, and he's not just going off of talking points. And he can also take terminology and tell a story from it, so he can engage people at a different level. From a language perspective, he makes his message accessible while also maintaining scientific credibility. And he also has a tendency to use a technical term and then explain what it means to bring people up to his level, which is a very, very powerful tool. And so the bottom line is that he really appeals to a sense of wonder, and then he backs it up with facts. He then explains those facts in a way that doesn't make anyone feel inferior or that they don't know or less than for not understanding the scientific jargon behind it. So what he really does is he strives to make science accessible for everyone. And within selling your business and within selling your innovation, it really comes down to these two competing worlds. There is the scientific truth and the political truth. And by political truth, I do not necessarily mean actual policies and laws passed by the government, although there are many of those that do apply. But rather, these are these gray area, intangible elements that drive decisions forward. And both have to be incorporated into a winning strategy because, as you can see from the chart, your innovation and your business sits in the middle of both. There is no shortage of demand for innovation. What there is a shortage of is knowledge and the proper steps that one must take to create a space for science and technology to thrive. And there are going to be many components that play a key role in your success, but more often than not, the biggest driving force will be people. It will be people and their influence to push your idea over the top, whether it be through policy implementation, connections, and network. their influence, advocacy, funding, market knowledge, etc., or just simply word of mouth. So, what we need to do is get these people to the table and on your side. And the way that we are going to start to do that is understanding human evolution and how our brains evolved. It was survival, not knowledge, that drove the evolution of the human brain. I'm going to say that again because it seems somewhat counterintuitive. It was survival, not knowledge, that drove the evolution of the human brain. So early on in the hunter and gatherer phase, survival meant being able to anticipate and assess danger and make a good decision about how to respond to it. What it also meant, though, was strength in numbers. So those who were successful knew how to be accepted within a community and really adapt appropriately to its cultural norms. Now, since all of our societies began, people have had to decide what to share and what not to share. So things that might be seen as crazy or an outlandish idea, and when to actually conform to have strength in numbers. In modern times, we don't really face the same sort of threats as wild beasts and poisonous berries, but our survival instincts are still very much at work. So our brains evolved to protect our worldview, and we naturally default to the norm, so what is normal to us, and seek out what we hope to expect and what we've always expected to maintain the status quo. And so what that means is that when a new concept or idea is introduced that challenges what we thought to be true, our brains naturally respond on the defensive, even if what is being introduced is factually accurate. A really extreme example of this is the flat earth movement, who, they really insist upon a reality where the world is flat, even though every single scientific experiment that they've conducted has proven them wrong. Their response is always that they must be conducting the experiments incorrectly. And so what this really boils down to is that ideas that seem strange from an intellectual point of view can really be rejected from social interactions and from like a society construct point of view. And so arguments that are backed by social and societal motivations are more likely to take hold. So what that really means is that ideas that seem more normal or seem more comfortable to people are more likely to be mass adopted. And so in other words, what this comes down to is that logic does not convince people to buy, emotion does. And this takes me to my next point, which is perception is extremely powerful. And our brains perceive anything that is new as being dangerous. And so what this boils down to is that all technological innovations are immediately and initially met with fear, especially radical ones. So if anything's revolutionary, and this is in large part because introducing ideas alone are not effective when you don't know how people are going to respond. So most people, they will start off by just stating facts. But when you lead with just information, you immediately put up a barrier between yourself and others. And instinctually, people just don't like what they don't understand. And so to overcome that emotional barrier, you need to be able to understand the drivers within the community that you are trying to reach and tailor your message to those values. Understanding both of these will really help you pinpoint the skepticism and the fear in others, even when it is masked as something else, and employ tactics to get around it rather than be frustrated and think you've hit the end of the line. So 2 tactics that you can employ is first, you can tell them a story. There is a really interesting neurological phenomena that occurs in your brain when hearing a story. If you are just presented with facts and data, our brains work to decode those into meaning. But when you are told a story, your brain decodes the language, but it also activates the motor cortex that goes through all of the motions of telling the story. And so it imprints that story on your brain the same way that a memory would. And this really helps give an experience that serves to enhance the memory of the listener and also remember what you were telling them. Another thing you can do is really replace fear with curiosity and excitement before you impart your knowledge. So you want to paint a picture of what the world could be like. You want to get them interested. You want to get them invested. You can also help create the space for your discovery within them, because this is really how ideas survive. So we talked about really what sets up the human mind to receiving information and the mode that they best receive it. But one tactic that you can also do is you can help change your language. So in the space community, and really in any industry, but especially in space, we talk to ourselves a lot. We talk in acronyms, we talk in statistics. We will reference a company in a shorthand that not everybody knows widely. And that will immediately create an in crowd, out crowd with folks that you are engaging with and make it feel not accessible for people to come and engage your information. So, what this slide shows are tactics that you can employ to help change your language to bring other people to the table. So, these 4 points are things that you should either eliminate completely, explain after you say them, or describe in more depth. So the first is acronyms. We all know what these are. If it's a shorthand of what you call a company, if there's an agency that goes by a 3-letter acronym, but globally people might not know what that acronym means, definitely either don't use it or explain it or say it in its full name. The next is technical terminology and jargon. So this is sort of insider shop talk. If there are certain terms that only quantum physicists know or only electrical engineers know, if you're going to use them, give context or find another way to describe what you're wanting to get across with which sometimes is just describing the impact to the person you're talking to. The next is any special uses of common words. And what this means is that if there is a word that is commonly known in a language, but it is used as a slang for another industry, that if it's used, it might give a different context to the listener, do not use it or explain it. Sometimes the explaining takes a bit more to do because there's cultural references and other parts to it. So in that sense, it's better to just eliminate it. And then the last are any phrases referring to processes, procedures, and protocols. While you don't necessarily need to describe these, a lot of times these are not helpful when getting someone behind your idea and behind your business, because this is going too much in the weeds where you should just be talking about the impact of what you were doing to their bottom line. And this next slide just illustrates in a bit of a funny way how two people can have a miscommunication. So there is a great story, and I believe that I told it on the last workshop when talking about the difference between competition of status quo sometimes being a competition. So people believing that there is a particular way that things should get done. So before the automobile was ubiquitous and we see it everywhere, it was being invented while everybody else was using a horse and buggy. So if this person on the right was explaining, a mode of transportation that gets you from A to B that might fit 2 people without actually explaining what it looks like, the other person might be thinking about a horse. So you want to get as specific as you can to the context and the usability of that person, because oftentimes people go into conversations with an assumption that there is a baseline of understanding, and oftentimes there isn't, especially when you're dealing with radical technology, with new ideas. So make sure you are as specific and also use plain language to get everyone on the same playing field before you start to continue to explain your idea. And one thing that you can do to help aid this is making the connection for them. And I always classify this as like showing your work. So just as you had to do in math class, to be able to get a good grade from your teacher, you couldn't just write the answer often. You had to show the process on how you got to that answer. The same thing may be a helpful tactic for you in explaining your idea and your business. Because again, for your peers, it might not be necessary evident what it is you were trying to drive toward. So sharing that with someone, sharing with them your thought process, bringing them along in the conversation and your development journey can help get them on your side, on the same page, and helpfully create new connections and maybe new market opportunities for what it is you're trying to do. So this next part that we're going to go into is a tactic that you can use to understanding your audience. So the first two parts talked about how people evolved, how their brains work, how you should give them information, tricks to be able to do it. But we now need to know who it is we're talking to. So if you've watched any of the other workshops, this structure will somewhat look familiar to you. In one of the previous ones, I called it a persona canvas. This is also a persona canvas, but in a different way. The previous one we ran through in the last workshop was looking at a company. So looking at, what makes a company different? How do they distinguish themselves? What are their goals and values? What this persona canvas is for you to put the person's information that you are going to try to be selling to. The reason why this is important is that sometimes people have the same script that they give to everyone. And in the last workshop, I talked in depth about why that isn't helpful, because you have to be able to explain your work in a way that's impactful to them. What this persona canvas will help you do is to get down as much information about that person that you know or that you can find, and will allow you to drive a conversation in a way that appeals to their emotion, that appeals to their motivation, and uses language that's at a baseline of what they understand so that you can scale from there. A lot of this information, if you don't actually know the person personally, can sometimes be gleaned from looking them up online, reading their bios, looking at things they post on LinkedIn. So don't worry if you're somewhat doing this for a cold contact, you want to get a hold of. Some of this information you can still find. So at the top, what you want to put is the person's company. So obviously the name, so you know who you're talking to and what their affiliation is. But you also want to know how big the company is and how they are structured. That can help a lot with understanding the decision-making process, which we will go to later, but also sometimes drive the culture. Smaller companies generally tend to have different cultures than large companies. And so that might also give you insight into how they work with their peers, what kind of objectives they take, also how busy their calendar is. It can tell you a lot about the person. Then you want to know their role. And some of these are data points, right? So their title, their position within the company, their primary responsibility. So really knowing kind of what they do on a day-to-day basis. Then you want to write down their goals as much as you can decipher. And this is really looking at the individual's goals and also the individual's goals as part of the company. So as an individual goal, they might be somebody that's out there as a champion for entrepreneurs. They say this in posts on LinkedIn, they engage in that. So understanding maybe that a goal for theirs might be to engage with companies and give them advice. One of their goals may be to become higher on the speaking circuit. You can glean all this information. So understanding what their goals are also gives you a bit of insight into their motivation and will allow you to speak to that more accurately. Then you want to go to their values, and this can be approached in a couple of ways. So obviously companies have specific values, specific missions, or really causes that they are focused on. And you can also see if the person has put out any values through their personal brand, if there is something that they particularly focus on. This also helps you get a bit more into motivation. Challenges can be an interesting one, but this is really looking at what are the biggest things that are keeping them up at night. And these can be internal and external. And you don't just have to think about the things that you can solve. So obviously, when you talk to them about your product or your business, there are going to be certain pain points that you are going to, talk to. And we talked about how to illuminate pain points in the last workshop, but this may be, if they work for a company that is focused on an ethical use of artificial intelligence. Some of the things that might be keeping them up at night is the advent of things like ChatGPT or any of these open AI, photo sites and WordPress sites. So you can get creative with this one and speculate a bit with this one, but knowing what is driving their motivation, what they think about on a daily basis, will really help you make another connection. The bottom left is personal information. So what else do you know about them that might help make an impact to the process or strengthen your relationship? These are things like, are they an alumni from the same university? Are they a father? Are they a mother? Do they volunteer in the community? This is really like personal data points about them beyond just their position to their job and their company. This will help you make a personal connection and sort of get rapport early on. People like to work with people that they like. And so that just establishes more of a connection. The next is understanding the decision-making process. You may know this and you may not know this, but it is helpful if you can speculate. And so what this looks at is, are they the decision maker? Are they part of the decision-making train? Do they like to have a conversation and make a judgment call, or do they like to have a conversation and then get some data to back up what you are saying? Do they like to make decisions alone? Do they like to make decisions by committee? This will also help you better tailor your message and your approach in a way that is going to be the best for them and that they're going to be willing to engage in. And then lastly are the potential opportunities. And so this is how you can work with them. So what kind of alignment is there between you, your business, and them? How would you characterize what your goal is for the relationship? Are you looking for a potential partnership? Are you looking for them to be a customer? Are you looking for them to be an advocate? Are you looking for them to maybe give introductions to other people within their community? But knowing what that opportunity is, that connection point, will also allow you to better drive the conversation to get to your ask and make it very clear for them to say yes, no, and pass you on in the right direction. The last thing we'll cover are tips to help you create the best impression to make long-lasting relationships. So the first is that the onus is on you. After you make the connection, you need to be the one that follows up and make the first move. And this mostly, especially if you're meeting someone in person, is continuing in a different and new forum. So that could be engaging with them on LinkedIn, that could be engaging with them, via email, and really maintaining that connection. The reason why this is important is for a couple of reasons. The first piece is that in networking, and especially in, a lot of business settings, people meet a lot of people, and you would be surprised how far doing what you say you're going to do goes. So I have been in plenty of situations where I have engaged with people and they say they're going to do something and it never happens. And so that shows something about you as an entrepreneur, about your, your eagerness and your persistence, which is part of this slide. And so definitely follow up. And if they're in a place where it's not immediately obvious to you, how you might be able to engage with them now or how you guys could help each other, it still is worth maintaining the connection to create them as a relationship partner, to create that warm connection. So tips that you can do is, if you're reading an article that reminds you of them, send it to them. Or if you are in a place where you're locally close, go ahead and schedule coffee every quarter. But maintaining that connection and you being the one to continue driving it, especially if they're going to be an important partner to you and connection for you, is really on you. The next tactic that you can do is really being specific and intentional about how you follow up. So you want to be specific in your email subject line or your LinkedIn subject line as much as possible. And you really want to use that space to communicate what that conversation is about or what that email is about. because this helps save the person time. So people prioritize emails or messages on LinkedIn or whatever sort of forum it is, just as they do tasks. So you can think about how somebody goes about their day and fills out their to-do list. They always have their most important things at the top, generally the ones that are going to take a lot of time, take a lot of mental capacity, and then things flow from there. It's the same as emails. Email boxes can get very, very crowded. And if somebody comes in and maybe has 30 emails waiting for them, they're going to have to prioritize which they're going to respond to more quickly. So if you send an email that the subject line just says, hey, versus an email that says following up 5-minute read, I know if I'm looking at that one email is only going to take me 5 minutes to read and respond to. The other, I don't even know what the context is, and I may not open it because I don't have the time to do so. So be as specific as possible. And it is a really useful tactic to also, get the open rate much quicker. A pro tip that you can also do to go one step further is if you have a very specific subject line, in the very, very top of the body of the note, you can say no action required or just need to schedule or 5 minutes to let them know what action is required of them. That also is a really conscientious thing that you can do to save their focus and their time. The third thing is being open and honest about what it is you were hoping to achieve from that relationship. This will really help manage expectations about what you were going to ask of them. An example that I always use for this is the concept of picking someone's brain. That is a very common term that people use in business, but it can mean a lot of different things. It can mean everything from meeting up with someone in potentially like a mentor capacity to learn about how they got to their point in their career and ask for advice. It can also mean you wanting to get very specific business advice from them or having them look at your business plan or your model. Or it can be, hey, I want to pick your brain on 10 people that I need to go after to get investment. Those span the gamut. Those also are very specific asks that not everybody might be comfortable with. So being open about your expectations is a courteous thing that you can do for them to allow them to say yes or no, to further the engagement, or potentially pass you to the right person that's going to get to your goals and objectives. And then the last piece is never leaving the guesswork up to them. You always want to communicate suggested next steps. This applies to interactions, but also to pitch decks. I have seen plenty of companies talk about their great idea and talk about why they're passionate about it, and then just expect the other person to know what to do with it or how to follow up. So you need to communicate what those next steps are. Is it an introduction to 10 people? Is it a follow-up in a quarter to get more and to give more information and get more advice? That will allow there to not be a gray area of how to engage and sort of create this awkward relationship about who owns what and who's supposed to communicate at what time. It's also really courteous because it shows that you have a lot of foresight into your objectives. And again, it allows people to either opt in or out and give you to the right person that might actually be the most beneficial for your business. And so the reason that I titled this slide Peskiness versus Persistence is there really is a fine line. Sometimes networking makes people very queasy because they think that if they reach out to someone and they don't hear back, if they continue to reach out, it becomes a bit pesky. So this is to allow you to be persistent with intention and hopefully get a better response from the person that you were hoping to make that connection with. And that concludes our final workshop. I hope that you found the information, informative and supplemental tools and tricks that you can use to really enhance your narrative structure and your pitch decks and any of your business engagements going forward. If you have any questions relating to this workshop or any of the previous workshops, our final live Q&A is going to be held September 18th at 11 a.m. Eastern, where you will have direct access to myself and some of the other participants to engage in broader conversations related to these topics. I want to thank you for tuning in and showing, interest and enthusiasm for the future of space. We at Space Foundation are very excited about what the future holds, and we firmly believe that there is a place for everyone. And so we look forward to seeing you later. Thank you.